Thanks for joining us again. Another one of our Safer at Home series. Glad you're here. So we watched Winter try to make a reappearance tonight. So I'm glad you're joining us tonight. Before we get started, a couple of things. As you know, all our talks are brought to us by Cape Cod 5, First Citizens Federal Credit Union, and Martha's Vineyard Savings. Every book that we've got in our selection of authors, including this one, is available at a Cousins bookseller in Falmouth. So we hope that you participate and partake of the locals and support the local business. If you would, we want to make sure that everybody mutes themselves so when we can hear our speaker. And at the end, we'll take questions and use the chat feature down below. Really excited tonight. Robert Kolker is a former editor and a managing editor at New York Magazine. He's written for several magazines. He's also written a couple of books, one of which has gone on to Netflix, and he's written this book that we're going to talk about tonight, Hidden Valley Road, which among other things was an Oprah Winfrey choice for book award. And this is one of the most compassionate books I've ever seen written about a family and their travails. Would you welcome our guest tonight, Robert Kolker?
Hi, everyone. Hi, Mark. And thank you, everyone. I'm really happy to be talking with you all tonight. Mark, I think the format tonight is that I might speak a little bit about the book and how I came to the material, and then we can all open it up to a conversation. So I'm definitely looking forward to talking with all of you. But I want to start by saying that there probably a year doesn't go by where I don't spend at least a week in Cape Cod, usually in mid-Cape, which is where my mother-in-law is. And in fact, I was married 22 years ago in Provincetown. We're New Yorkers, but my family is from my wife's family is from Massachusetts, and my mother-in-law lives there, and my father-in-law, when he was alive, was there. They retired there, and they had rented there every summer. And so I've spent maybe 30 summers at Cape Cod. And when it came time to get married, we thought we would have a destination wedding, but they were on to us. And we wanted music, and we wanted it on a Saturday night. And every town, from the bridge up through Falmouth and all the way up through, they had set up rules and regulations saying that there couldn't be any music, amplified music after like 10 p.m. or something like that. And or maybe even earlier. So we kept going and going and going, and we made it to Provincetown, where we learned that the base of the Pilgrim Monument was open for renting for the first time for weddings and celebrations. There had been one commitment ceremony, but we were the first wedding at the base of the Pilgrim Monument in Provincetown in 1999. And it was in October, which meant it was off season, which meant that the town was pretty empty, which meant that we had the run of the place. Everyone, all the wedding guests, it was a little like a fairy tale, like a total, the whole town was we were the only thing happening that weekend. And so we would point up to the tent and say, and to the monument and say, we're getting married there. It was really very special. And of course, my mother-in-law was tickled to hear that there's an event for the book happening in Falmouth, because she's been looking at all the coverage this whole time. But I'm pleased to talk to you about the book. It's been quite a year. Certainly, the pandemic's been strange, and I've spent most of it on Zoom talking about the book. And the reception to the book has been more than I ever could have imagined, especially during a year when there was so much else competing for people's attention. And as far as nonfiction books go, I could not have been asked for a more widely received book, and for such great praise. So it's been quite overwhelming, and I'm still kind of processing it. But I can tell you today about how it all came about. The book is a narrative nonfiction book about a family but it's also a medical mystery. And there's a second story running through the bottom of it all the way through about the science of mental illness and how our understanding of severe mental illness has changed over the years. And that is not something that I'm an expert in. I'm much more of an expert in the second part, which is, writing about people going through emotional difficulties. My career really took shape at New York Magazine, where I wrote feature stories and cover stories. And during my 17 years there, I was drawn to stories that required a lot of research, like this book does, but also at the end of the day, focused on the interior emotional lives of ordinary people. And so hopefully the goal was, through exhaustive reporting, I'd be able to sort of lift the veil on a part of society that you'd otherwise never see. And most important of all, recognize the humanity in people that we might never have considered before are really like us. And I did this a lot with crime stories at New York Magazine, but a few science stories as well. My first book, Lost Girls, was a true crime book about an unsolved series of killings in Long Island. It was a murder mystery, but it had that second set of issues bubbling underneath. It had that social issues to discuss about the 5 victims who are caught up in this unsolved mystery and their lives and what made them vulnerable. And in the end, Lost Girls was really about 5 families, the families of the missing women, and about the strife in those families and the estrangements and the bonds that certain people shared and how those families came together. And then, years later with Hidden Valley Road, I quite by happenstance happened on a way to explore that very same subject of families in crisis more deeply than I ever dreamed I'd be able to. And that really began 5 years ago, almost exactly 5 years ago in 2016, when a friend of mine introduced me to the 2 sisters in the family, Margaret and Lindsay, who are the youngest of 12 children from Colorado Springs, Colorado, the Galvin family. And their 10 older siblings were all male. So they were the only girls, 10 boys and then 2 girls. And of those 10 older brothers, 6 of them were diagnosed with schizophrenia. They told me that straight off the bat on the phone. And the more they spoke to me in that first phone call, the more I learned, the more I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It really was quite sad and quite horrifying. There was a brother who was sent to state mental hospital more than 20 times and always coming home and then getting into trouble with police coming to the house, and then he would have to go back to the hospital again. There was another son who sent threatening letters to the president, and then there was another who believed he was Paul McCartney for a while. And there was a murder-suicide of Brian Galvin, who in the mid-70s killed his girlfriend and then turned the gun on himself. And that wasn't even the worst of it. Then the sisters started to tell me that Jim Galvin, their brother, the second oldest in the family, sexually abused them both from the time they were both very young. There was also clergy abuse, which they suspected happened to the family. So all of this in one family, I really couldn't imagine it. And my immediate reaction was how a family could even stay together after all of these things had happened. And I wondered about these women I was talking to on the phone. They were in their 50s now and very pleasant on the phone. And I wondered why they wouldn't have run away the first chance they got and never come back. And certainly wondered why they would want a book written about it. But what I learned in talking with them is that they were quite hopeful. They felt a sense of accomplishment because each of them had found a way through their traumatic childhoods. And they also told me that the family has a scientific legacy. They told me that the family is so statistically unusual that they became one of the first families to be studied by the National Institute of Mental Health as part of the effort to search for the genetic origins of schizophrenia. And sure enough, later on, I got on the phone with different scientists, and I learned that samples of the Galvin family's DNA had helped form the cornerstone of genetic research into schizophrenia that continues today. And at the time, even the family hadn't quite known that, but they knew that their family was special. They just were looking for someone to help them find out how. And I think that was the upshot of it. They sort of wanted a happy ending for their family. They wanted their family's story told as a work of independent journalism. And they believed that every other member of the family, the mentally ill brothers who were still alive and the non-mentally ill brothers, they believed that they all would participate. And they believed their mother, Mimi, would participate too. She was about 90 years old. Their father was deceased, but their mother was 90. And this was the part where I really was skeptical at the beginning, because As a reporter, I know about the HIPAA laws, about the medical privacy laws, and I know you can't just write about someone's private medical information in a publication. And no one has to be told how sensitive a subject mental illness can be, that this is probably information that somebody would want to keep private. And that's one thing, actually, by the way, I learned as I continued work on this book, and my editor learned it too. Each of us would tell people about this book project, and suddenly we would hear stories we had never heard from before from people who we thought we knew pretty well. Stories about things in their family, about people with severe mental illness that they just never discussed because there's a stigma, sometimes a real taboo, but almost always a stigma. And I think it's even greater than autism, even greater than bipolar disorder or depression or Alzheimer's disease. Schizophrenia is something people just don't talk about. And my biggest worry was that I would say yes to the sisters, and then I would start making calls and doing reporting and research. And I would start a fight in the family because a brother would rise up and would stand up and say, "What are you kidding? I don't want this book to happen." And I'd be adding to the grief and pain of this family. And that's certainly something I didn't want to do. So I kind of hit the pause button after talking with them. And I said, what if I just very gradually got on the phone with a different member of your family over the next 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks, and also called up some medical people who had treated your family over the years, just to learn exactly what was unusual about the family. And we would all know at the end of these conversations just how doable this would be. And they said, sure. And this was when I started to get surprised because everybody was ready. Their mother, Mimi, didn't want to talk about this for years, but now she was ready. And the older brothers, they were ready too. I think many of them were deferring to their younger sisters because the sisters had really suffered a great deal as being the youngest in the family. They were at home the longest, so a lot of the bad stuff really trickled down to them. And so when their sisters said they wanted this, they weren't going to disagree with them. And I went out to Colorado and met the mentally ill brothers and got to know them a little bit too, and saw that they weren't, that this isn't a cookie cutter condition, that they're individual people who I would be able to portray as human beings and not just as plot devices, because that was another real big worry of mine early on, that this book would be a little like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and that as soon as a brother got sick, you would never hear from them again, and they would just be called sick, and you wouldn't really know them as people. And I found that it was possible to do that. So I started to get excited, frankly, because the book started to feel special to me. I started reading a little bit about mental illness, and I found that the best books that I could find that were really translated what severe mental illness, particularly schizophrenia, was like for lay people, those books were memoirs. They were first-person books about someone's uncle or about themselves even. There are really some excellent ones. But this book would be something different. It would be a third-person book that would hopefully read like a novel, like a family saga, with part 1 about one generation and part 2 about the next generation growing up. And perspectives woven in from everybody who gets interviewed, almost like a 360-degree view of a very large family. And I started to realize no one had really tried it before. And it was exciting to have something unique, because as a journalist and nonfiction author, you certainly don't want to redo what's been done before. And then I also was a little intimidated because it meant really digging into the science of mental illness. And we can talk about this a little bit more in the Q&A, but the challenge here was to try to add perspective and context to the Galvin family story and help people understand what the options were back then and what people believed and knew about schizophrenia and how wrong they were then and what we know now. I needed to do all that without making it seem like homework, like I was making you eat your vegetables or something. And so I really looked to, some of my favorite nonfiction authors for inspiration. I read a lot of Michael Lewis and Catherine Boo, who wrote Behind the Beautiful Forevers. These are people who dip into very complicated material, and they are able to very, very artfully weave in some of the most potentially dry and geeky information, but you don't care because you really want the information because it raises the stakes for the story that they're telling, and their story remains compelling. And that was my job with this book, to try to do it that way. My other job was to try not to other the mentally ill people. As I said before, I didn't want them to come off as monsters, and I didn't want them to come off as somehow mystical people with second sight. I didn't want to romanticize mental illness, and I didn't want to be derogatory about it either. I just wanted them to be human beings. And I also wanted to talk about the non-mentally ill siblings, particularly the two sisters, who I decided would be the people I would keep coming back to in the book as sort of the mainstays, who would help readers sort of come back to a basic starting point if they felt like they were getting a little too mixed up as to who was who. You'd always come back to Lindsay and to her sister Margaret, and you would learn about how they made it through their lives. And I didn't want to lose sight of the importance of the story, because the stakes are, of course, very high. Schizophrenia affects 1 in 100 people. That's more than 3 million people in America. That means that, you know, if you walked into a Costco, somebody there probably has severe mental illness like schizophrenia. That's 82 million people worldwide. And it sucks up a tremendous amount of resources and healthcare resources in America. And the suicide rate is alarmingly high for people with schizophrenia. And as a population, they often get ignored. They aren't vocal to the degree that people with prostate cancer or breast cancer are. They are not mainstream enough to get that sort of attention. And so the meds for this population haven't really gone through any real innovations in generations. The same drugs the Galvin boys got in the 60s and 70s are basically the same drugs that are being prescribed now. And that was pretty alarming. I wanted to make sure that that got through as well. But overall, I wanted it to be a family story. And I came away thinking that even if you aren't interested in the subject of schizophrenia, the book could be inspiring in a way, because it's a story not just about survival, but about resilience and about redemption and about hope. It's not just about how things go wrong. It's about how years afterward, you look back and investigate the mystery of what went wrong and reevaluate your lives and the lives of your parents. And you just rediscover the humanity in your own afflicted family members. There was a lot to be inspired by in this book. And it really was not, the sad experience that I were worried that it would be in the beginning. It really was quite hopeful. I guess I can stop there and open this up to a conversation. If some of you have read the book, I'm happy to take questions, but I'm also happy to talk in general about how work went on it and so forth. But thank you.
Thank you, Robert. You put a passage in there that for me as a layman was really helpful, and I'm going to quote it directly. Is that schizophrenia is not about multiple personalities. It is about walling oneself off from consciousness, first slowly and then all at once, until you no longer are accessing anything that others accept as real. And you talk about that, and I think for somebody like me, and hopefully for somebody like, as you just explained, for you, it was all new and it was something that had to be explained, and that for these 6 not quite adult males, it's like they could feel something off. Something was wrong and they knew it as they got older. And you also talk about the nature versus nurture argument. So can you explain a little bit more about what you discovered about schizophrenia and how this shaped your reporting?
Sure. When I think about it, I think there were 3 kind of big myths that I needed to get out of the way and defuse, really demystify immediately. The first was the one you mentioned in that passage, which is that schizophrenia is not about multiple personalities, that there might be something called multiple personality disorder, but that's not what schizophrenia is. It's just an unfortunate thing that the Latin root of schizophrenia means split. But what it means, it's a split from reality, not a split personality. That was one. And then the second one was that with the right meds, you could be cured. A part of me really felt that way before I met the Galvin family. And as I said a moment ago, that might be somewhat true for people with anxiety or with depression or bipolar disorder, that you could manage your life and be fully functional with the right treatments. But the treatments aren't there for schizophrenia. That was the second myth. And then the third myth, and I've already gotten away from myself, but it was in your question, Mark, I'm sorry. It's about,
Well, I said about nature and nurture.
yeah.
And well, in just
Oh, yes. The third myth is that schizophrenia is a disease at all, because it really isn't like COVID-19 or like breast cancer or prostate cancer. You can't look at it in a dish and say, yep, that's schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a classification. It's a term that is used by people to diagnose what's wrong with you. So if your symptoms align with what's written down and called schizophrenia, then you are classified as schizophrenia, and you may respond to, your symptoms may be muffled or muted by certain drugs. But that doesn't mean that schizophrenia is an actual thing. It's just it's a syndrome, I guess is what you would call it. And so what that means is that the debates over what it really is never stopped. From the moment that they came up with this classification somewhere around 1903 or 1906 and called it schizophrenia. It had a different name before that, but from the moment that happened, suddenly the question became, well, what is it really? You know, what if maybe it's something your parents did to you. Maybe it's trauma you had at childhood. And then other people said, no, look at royal families in Europe. You can see genetically that madness runs in families. And so this has to be genetic. And then the other side says, well, if it's genetic, how come it isn't passed down from parent to child? And the debates raged on throughout most of the century until finally, when the human genome was sequenced, the issue was somewhat settled, but then it shifts again, because it's not just genetics. It's genetics with a little bit of the environment spiced in there. It's about genes that are activated by environmental triggers. And then the question becomes, what are those triggers? So that nature and nurture battle winds up being a second story that happens in there. And of course, in hindsight, you can look at any of the Galvin brothers and you can see two things. The first is, if you want to find a trauma, a reason that you think might cause their schizophrenia, it would not be hard to find them. You know, there's Brian killed his girlfriend and then himself after his girlfriend broke up with him. Or Donald first went to the hospital after his wife broke up with him. Peter had his first big psychotic break just a couple weeks after watching his father have a stroke just a few feet in front of him. Matthew had head trauma from an accident, and so forth. You can look at triggers, but then you look at their symptoms and you think, well, in a different world, you might actually argue that they had different diseases, because their symptoms are so different from one another, even though they all are classified as schizophrenia. Donald is delusional. He believes he's related to an octopus, but Joseph had actual hallucinations. He looked up in the sky and saw things, saw a Chinese emperor looking down on him, which is different from a delusion, because he knew that they weren't real. He just said, I'm having a hallucination, look at it. You know, Peter was slightly more manic, and Jim was paranoid and abusive. And so it's just further proof that you could call it schizophrenia, but it's not a cookie cutter condition. But I think that the thing that I learned from folks I talked to for the book that really amazed me the most is that it's possible that one day we just won't use the term anymore. That the more we find out about how the genetics and environment play into one another and how brain function actually works, the more we may realize that what we call schizophrenia now is actually 6 or 7 or 8 different, totally discretely different brain disorders that each require different treatments. And it'll be almost as if schizophrenia is just a symptom, and then the actual disease is something else. And the best analogy for this is the concept of a fever. You know, hundreds of years ago, if you had a fever, that was your disease. You know, what's wrong with Bob? He has a fever. And what are we going to do about this fever? But then as medicine got more advanced, we realized that fever isn't the problem. Fever is the symptom. Fever it shows that you either have a bacterial infection or a virus or something else. And so that could be the same thing with schizophrenia. It could just be a symptom of something else.
There was always this belief that it was, this kind of without scientific support, that it was the mother's fault. It came from the mother. And you write, you've got a quote in there from Mimi. And by the way, Donald and Mimi Galvin, the fact they even had 12 kids, her own doctor said, stop having kids, I'm not going to cure it, I'm not going to treat you anymore. And just because you got a quote in there. And so I was crushed because I thought I was such a good mother. I baked a cake and a pie every night, or at least had Jello with whipped cream. Did the prospect of were things exacerbated because they had 12 kids in one house? Everyone couldn't have their own room, were things just exacerbated? And did you talked about the triggers for the 6 brothers that were diagnosed? Did the 4 brothers who were not diagnosed with schizophrenia, did they not have a traumatic experience? Were they just able to escape?
Right, that's the issue, right? I always think that the search for triggers winds up being silly, because all of us have trauma in our lives. And if there is such a trigger, if schizophrenia does get environmental triggers, it's clearly not the same trigger for everyone. So what are you going to do if you find out someone is genetically predisposed to have schizophrenia? Do you have them live in a bubble? But that alone, that would be a trauma too. So, you can't escape. It becomes an academic issue. I mean, certainly the other children did as well. And so then the question becomes, what else is happening here? What's happening genetically? As the family gets studied, they realize that there is a vulnerability that they share. There is something in their genes. The issue there is that they found many, many different genetic mutations that have something to do with schizophrenia. This family has one of them, but there are many, many others. And there's so many of them, and the potential to cause havoc is so tiny with each individual one, that pharmaceutical companies are kind of stumped, because there's no one particular thing to try to medicate. And that's where we're at the moment, unfortunately. Oh, but you had asked about number of children. I'm a little far afield from that. And actually, I see in the chat, Eileen, she asked as well. And I think that at the very least, there were fewer eyes on what was going on. And so a bad situation became worse. So for instance, Jim Galvin, the abusive brother, he was living away from the family down in the same city with a wife and kid. And he came in like the cavalry and said, you're having problems at home with some of the sick kids. Why don't you send some of the little ones over to me for the weekends, and we'll they can stay with me, and it'll be a little less pressure for everybody. And so that happened. And meanwhile, he sexually abused the 2 girls. In a smaller family, there wouldn't have been the need for the kids to go away on the weekend. So that alone is an issue. I have long and really great conversations with readers about the number of people in the family, because the question then becomes, why did they do it to begin with? Is it just an indicator of just how too hands-off they were as parents, how too overconfident they were that they could solve any problem? And I think those are all valid questions. And I think it has something to do with the confidence of the times, something to do with the laid back, they were not laid back parents, they were disciplined parents, but they also felt like they could handle anything. And it never occurred to them that there'd be something they couldn't handle, and that they felt like 12 children was going to be a snap almost. It was never a trauma. That was never a difficult subject for the parents. They liked it, and they felt it made them distinctive in their community. That quote from Mimi about how she always made a pie every night or a Jello with whipped cream, she too till the very end, was very invested in the idea that this family was a model family that others you looked at as an example until things went wrong. And she's part of her still kind of was living in that before era, that still gazing happily at that before snapshot as the years went on. And that sort of thing would frustrate her children, obviously, who felt like she was in denial too much. But at the same time, that same tunnel vision kept the family together. It really was a double-edged sword.
You made it a point, and you said at the top of your remarks that you wanted to talk to the surviving members of the family. You wanted to talk to all of them, you know, that they all had to be on board. One of the things that really impressed me about the book is you make all of them into people. You know, they're not just lumped into one thing. They all have their own individual identities, and you try to allow for that. You know, that this one's a little different than that one. But as you're talking to Mimi, the mother, mentioned she's 90. What was your opinion of her going in? And do you feel she was honest with you when you asked her about her family's life?
Well, she was 90, and so she was physically fragile, but she was mentally very sharp. But I certainly was not going to be prosecutorial with her when I talked with her. I wasn't going to grill her. And I kind of left that up to her daughters. So I sort of sat there at the dining room table, and she sat there too, and the two daughters sat there with me. And so I would ask a question that was vaguely difficult. Like, it was hard having, when Donald first got sick, the doctors were blaming you, right? Or something like that. And she would try to deflect it. She would say, oh yes, that was hard, but did you just try the dessert? It was delicious. And then I would smile because I thought, well, this is great. I'm getting a firsthand view of what Mimi is like. But the sisters would both groan and say, Mom, answer the question. And they would press her and try and get her to talk, have more real conversation. And it took a very long time, but she was able to engage in that way. I think, again, it was both a strength and a weakness for her that she wasn't going to dwell too much on the bad stuff, because that allowed her to wake up every morning and march to the doctor and make sure that one of the sons was getting medical attention for this and another son was getting attention for that. It allowed her to keep on going. She has an expression that pops up later in the book where she says, you can't be heartbroken every day, which is just stunning to me, because look at all the horrible things that have happened to her. Her heart must have been breaking every day. And yet that was her decision. She made a decision not to be heartbroken. Is that inspiring, or is that delusional? Like, what is it? And I think it's a little of both. And the kids think so too. The kids, in early conversations, the sisters and others in the family were highly critical of their mother, and they put their father on a pedestal. But then as the conversations went on, and as I talked with more of them, and as I learned more from other members of the family as well, who knew them at the time, what I learned was that the mother might have been in denial and that she might have made some colossal mistakes, but she was there. She was working the problem day in and day out all the time. And she was the reason the family stayed together. And that it was the father, who supposedly was such a hero, such an intellectual titan, someone they all aspired to be like, he was the one who kind of fell apart and who wasn't around and who kind of kept his distance. And he would make remarks saying, you know, you shouldn't baby the boys, you shouldn't, you know, they should grow up and stand on their own 2 feet. And then he kind of didn't get his hands as dirty. And so that complexity appealed to me. I wanted to get that across in the book, that what seemed like one thing actually was another. So part 1 of the book is kind of tough on the mother, and part 2 is a little nicer to her, and vice versa for the father.
Besides the fact that evidently schizophrenia affects more males than females statistically, but besides the same gender, were there any things that were the same for the 6 brothers, or are they all uniquely different in terms of their diagnosis and their symptoms, etc.?
I think the one thing they all shared, particularly as they were all getting sick, from what my learned in my reporting and from looking at the medical records, is they all seemed a little like they slowly became strangers to themselves. They didn't quite understand why they were doing some of the things they were doing. Sometimes it was impulsive behavior, like running into a bonfire during a pep rally at college. And other times it was more like withdrawing socially, or having delusions. But in any case, what they really all shared was this feeling like they lost self-awareness. And that's something that now that we focus on early intervention for illnesses like schizophrenia, we look for that, or doctors look for that sort of thing. They look for teenagers who are sort of not just withdrawing socially, but also are doing things and they don't understand why they're doing it. It's not just hearing voices or seeing visions. It's that subtle. They definitely shared that. And then that Matthew does have delusions like Donald does, only his sort of go in and out. He thought he was Paul McCartney for a while, now he doesn't anymore. And when his are mood activated, they're interesting because you can be having a really reasonable and fine conversation with Matthew, but then he'll, if he gets a little upset about something, if he gets frustrated about something, he'll spin out and he'll start talking about how if things don't go his way, there's going to be another hurricane that kills 400 people on the other side of the world somewhere. And he's serious. He thinks, it's just going to happen. His moods control the weather. But then he spins right back onto the road when he calms down a little bit. So that part gets kind of interesting.
You had to work with some medical professionals to learn about this, right? How was that, and how helpful were they? How closely affiliated were you with them in putting together, learning about schizophrenia and mental illness?
Yeah, I was very, very concerned that I would get something wrong about this family, and that also I would somehow miss the big picture, that the family would lead me astray and I would only write about some small aspect of schizophrenia and I'd miss out on something way more important. So I did a lot of checks and balances. So I would spend a lot of time with the two different researchers who are both still alive today, who both have been researching the family's genetic material back in the 80s. And then that research has then led them both down roads that have led to some really interesting advances today. So I wanted to tell their stories and talk with them about what the meaning of families like the Galvins are. But then I wanted to talk to people who didn't know anything about the Galvins and who had never really worked directly with either of these researchers, just to make sure that I was getting a real broader view and checking up on them. So I talked to folks like E. Fuller Torrey, who wrote the big book, Surviving Schizophrenia, that families really rely on as a resource even today. And I talked with Danny Weinberger over at Hopkins, and I spoke with Stephen Hyman at the Broad Institute, who really, the Harvard and MIT Research Institute is the one that's really most responsible for looking into the genetics of schizophrenia today. And so I tried to get that kind of like authoritative view. And then once I wrote about what I wrote about, I had to go to experts to really make sure that I wasn't getting it all wrong. So I had people who knew about neurology and neurobiology look at the brain parts of it, and had a genetics expert look at the genetics part. So it's like I was sending little pizza slices of the book off to various experts to verify that I was using terms correctly, that I wasn't saying something that seemed completely ridiculous to them. I wanted to make sure that I didn't set off anybody's BS detectors in any way.
I think when you're writing this book, tell me if I'm wrong here, but there's almost something Herculean about the two sisters, the two daughters. They're the 11th and 12th kids. They're the ones that have to bear the abuse. In your writing, you sound like you really admire what they've gone through, that they made it to the other side. And what was it like working and talking with them?
Well, I had a very early surprise when I was talking with them, because on that first phone call, it seemed like they were telling me the story of two sisters who really helped one another through a terrible childhood together. That they were sort of hand in glove. They were together the entire time. And I thought that that was the story that I was going to end up telling, about two sisters surviving. But then when I actually went out there and started to interview them separately, what I learned is that there were periods of their life where they really helped each other and they really saved each other at various points, but that at other points they really were at cross purposes for how they were going to deal with their trauma. That one sister really dove right back into the family eventually to try to do it better than her parents did and care for the family better. And it didn't matter if it hurt her relationships with others. And then the second sister, the older sister, Margaret, she wanted to do the opposite. She felt that the only way that she could survive her trauma is to create distance from the family and create a separation. And so the story of her adult life is of a sort of push me, pull you relationship with the family, where she sometimes drops out of sight and sometimes comes back in. And the two sisters have a real clash in that department, and their relationship ends up suffering. And so as soon as I got the gist of that, I started to worry. I thought this book was going to be about two sisters against the world. And then I stopped worrying pretty quickly, because I realized that this is a very relatable thing, that we all many of us have brothers and sisters, and when you grow up, the way we look at our families is different from how they look at it. There might be some overlap, but sometimes our memories are self-serving in different ways. And I thought, here with these two sisters, there's an opportunity to write about two different ways that two different people survived some of the worst things that could happen in a childhood. And so it was almost like a choice that you could give readers. Readers could read about them both. I would present the both of them in a sort of non-judgmental and sensitive way, but I wouldn't have to play referee between the two of them. I wouldn't have to pick one, because the readers could look and decide for themselves which one do they find more relatable to them. I had one reader say to me that she felt some days that she was more like Margaret and some days that she was more like Lindsay. And we all have like various roles that we play in our family. I mean, I have a brother and a sister, and I have an elderly father, and I don't live as close to my father as my sister does. So she's doing more for him. So where does that leave me? What do I do? What does that mean politically when I talk to my sister on the phone? How do we engage in that subject? Is it fair? It's never fair. Like, it always winds up being something. So I wanted to dig deep into what it was for this family, and I felt like they were giving me that opportunity.
Questions here. I haven't read the book yet, but I wonder if neighbors and teachers had any idea what was going on, and also has any other mental illness been identified in other generations in the nuclear family or the broader family tree?
That's a great question about neighbors. And I remember saying that to the sisters in the first phone call. I said, everyone in the street must have known what was going on in your house, right? And they said, yeah, but everybody was sort of doing their own thing in their houses too. Other families had their own stripes. So it's not like we were the only troubled family, but yes, they did know. And so I did end up talking to neighbors who had heard about this and that. The issue with the Galvins is that the children span 20 years. So it's not like anyone who grew up with the older kids was still around by the time the younger kids were around. So everybody, again, only had a small little slice of the puzzle, had a small little bit of the picture. There was no neighbor that had the full picture of what was going on in the family. And so you mind your own business and you don't see the bigger picture. And I've been getting emails since the book came out that have been fascinating, from people saying, I knew Peter and Mark in school, and I knew there was something up with them, but I had no idea they had older brothers, Donald and Jim, that were up to these things. That's completely news to me. And so everybody sort of gets a little bit of it. And there was a desperate search for reasons once the boys started getting sick. All through the 70s, they looked at the family tree. There is some mental illness somewhere in Don's family, a nephew here, perhaps bipolar illness in one brother. And so for the longest time, it was assumed that the problem must be on his side of the family. And yet, the genetic issue that the researchers found happens to be on Mimi's side of the family. So it just gets more and more, the plot keeps thickening. But that's the thing about schizophrenia, is that it's so rarely a direct inheritance. And this would have been a very different book if everybody had gotten sick the same way that grandpa did. But it just never, it wasn't like that. Like both grandpas and both grandmas didn't have schizophrenia or anything like it. So, and neither did the parents. So it winds up being anybody's guess, and lots of suspects, lots of things. They looked at the water, they tested it for, pollutants. They decided at some point it might be a vitamin problem, so they started taking megavitamins. There were lots of dead ends and lots of red herrings.
For those who haven't read the book, the family, Mimi, the mother, she comes from privilege. I mean, she has a rather distinguished background, rather cultured background. Donald, the father, is very proud of the fact that if you go and visit the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, their nickname Falcons comes from him. They were falconers. So this is not just some run-of-the-mill family. They were pretty successful. They were not necessarily bells of the ball, but people seem to know them. So what was to the people, how did people know what was going on, and how did they react to it because this is a rather influential family?
Yes, they were known. They were not the only super large family in town, but they were one of them. And then the falconry really made them celebrities. Don and Mimi were the ones who suggested to the Air Force. You remember the Air Force only became its own thing after World War II, and it only came to Colorado Springs in the 50s. And they were one of the first people in Colorado Springs as the academy was being built. And so Don and Mimi embraced falconry in Colorado. They saw the academy was coming, and they Don wrote a letter to the general in charge and said, the Navy has a goat and the Army has a mule, or do I have it the other way around? Anyway, they said the Air Force should have the Falcon, and they said yes, and they made it the Falcon. Not only that, Don started flying falcons with the academy and ran the program for the cadets and taught them falconry. And at football games, he would fly the falcons during halftime shows, and he did it on national television. So they were a seriously well-known family in that fashion. And then years later, he had a post-military career as an advisor to the governors of the Western states for economic development. So they had, I guess you could call it prestige without money, because they were a military family with one income, and it's not like he became an oil baron or anything like that. They had a very, money was always tight because they had 12 kids, but they had culture and they had panache, and they could be snobby about it for sure until things started going wrong. And there were a few years there where they hid it from everybody as much as they could, not just because they hoped against hope that things would get better on its own, but also because that prestige was the source of their livelihood. I mean, if Donald, as the advisor to state governors in the American West, suddenly had a son in the state mental hospital, that would be something that in the late 60s you would definitely want to keep a secret, because it would infect everything about how the family fared after that.
Question going back to this, why have mothers been blamed for this illness for so long?
That's this amazing thing. In the late 40s, the idea comes about there's the psychoanalysts in America who are greatly influenced by Freud and who believe that schizophrenia is curable and that it's caused by the environment. They blame the upbringing, and mostly they blame the mother. And this feeling kind of pervades psychoanalysis or psychotherapy, especially in America, for decades. And it doesn't really fall away until around 1980. I've talked to many people in psychiatry who were trained in the 1970s, and they said that in their training and residencies, they were told by the top people in their field that, bad mothering can cause schizophrenia. So it's a canard that kind of lasted a really long time. And the interesting thing about it to me is that it's not like there was a secret cabal of misogynists sitting around saying, let's blame it on women. These were people who felt like they were on the side of the angels. They were doing battle with the genetics experts and the biologists and the brain researchers who felt that the answer was lobotomy, or that the answer was sterilization or eugenics to try and breed mental illness out of you. So they were arguing, no, it's not genetic. It's not something you can breed out of you. It's a human illness that we get after we're born. We're not born with it, and we can cure it with the right treatment. We can cure it, and it's mom and dad's fault. So they felt they found a different target, also an inaccurate target, but a different target that they felt humanized the patient. Because at the time, people with schizophrenia, to the other side, to the geneticists and the biologists, people with mental illness were essentially like lab rats, for experimentation. They were almost subhuman. And this about people who with Down syndrome or other issues as well. They really were not treated as full-fledged human beings. And there's a whole racial element to this too, where that became an excuse to marginalize entire populations of Black Americans early in the century by calling them mentally ill. It just became a class issue. And that is that would have been a long detour for the book to take, so I only flick at it. But essentially what it means for the Galvins, the stakes it raises for the Galvins, is that they knew that if they called a doctor and said, our kids are acting weird, the first question from the shrink would be, what did you do wrong? Tell me about your parenting style. Do you coddle your children? Are you a bad parent? And that was something they weren't really a road they just were not going to go down. Much better to just hope it gets better on its own.
And following up that, Janet's question, was there any other support systems for the family? Anyone took an individual interest in the children?
There was one, like the cavalry coming in, there was a wealthy family that came and took one of the sisters out of the family when things were really bad, and also paid for certain treatments later on, but mostly they kind of kept to themselves. And one of the big problems with stigma is it means that you aren't reaching out for help. However, after a while, once the worst of it happened and there was no hiding it anymore, Mimi and Don Galvin really became like power consumers of the medical infrastructure in Colorado. They had one son going here and another son going there, sometimes in outpatient clinics with long-term injectable drugs, and other times at the state mental hospital, and then other times somebody would be at a halfway house. So there was a period in the 70s and 80s where they started to get to know everyone and really worked it hard. This was after they stopped hiding it.
Your first book, Lost Girls, was made into a film. Is this going to become a film or a series? And you also mentioned that unlike Lost Girls, you've said this before, that this book ends on a hopeful note. Tell me why you think it's hopeful.
Yeah, I did. I'm smiling because as I was working on it, people would say, what are you working on? And I would say, it's about a family with 12 children and 6 of them have schizophrenia. And their faces would drop and they would say, that sounds horrible. And I would say, no, there's a lot of hope. Honestly, there really is. And then they would kind of stop listening. And then I would interrogate myself. I'd say, why do I think this is so hopeful? But I do, because I think when I see the 6 surviving brothers who don't have mental illness, I see they all more or less have very functional lives. That if you ran into Lindsay or Margaret or the 4 brothers at the supermarket or at a ball game and just started chatting with them, you'd think, well, here's a very well-educated, sharp, functional person. They all have a certain amount of hypervigilance because of their traumatic childhoods, but they've made it through to the other side. And so my question becomes, how does that happen? What happens after the worst happens? What if I could write a book that wasn't about the car crash, but about what happens to the people who have to survive and keep on going after the car crash? And what wisdom might they have to impart to the rest of us? That's one reason why I think it's hopeful, because I've spent time with the family. But the other thing that I find hopeful is that there are actual scientific advancements that this family can take credit for. The people who studied them back in the 80s, if they hadn't studied them, they wouldn't have made it. They wouldn't have done the thing that led to the thing that led to the other thing that led to their advancements. And so that, to me, it's a hopeful story of the sometimes winding road that science takes, but that inevitably leads toward progress. And that made me, that kind of put wind in my sails early on. The fact that I knew that two different researchers were up to something hopeful about schizophrenia, in part because of work they had done with the Galvins, that kind of made me think that this book was going to be more hopeful than Lost Girls. And you're right about Lost Girls. I mean, to me, the theme of Lost Girls is that real life isn't like CSI, that there's just way too much chaos and randomness and incompetence and politics and hidden agendas and just plain apathy that happens in not just in law enforcement, but in all corners of the world, that means that you're not going to solve the mystery in an hour, that things just are going to fall away and fall through the cracks. And it's a sad story that is unfortunately a very real story.
So is this one going to be made into a movie or film?
I would like it to be. I think it would be a good miniseries. I think Lost Girls would have been a good miniseries too, but it came out before that era, so it was developed as a movie. It's funny to think that we all sit and binge our 6-episode or 12-episode shows, but Lost Girls came out in 2013, and Making a Murderer wasn't for another year or so on Netflix, which was like a documentary, but still, like the idea of sitting and binge watching something is relatively new.
So what's your next project? And how long did it take for you basically to come down from this one? Because how long did you work on it? How long did you need to unwind? What's next?
I'm still kind of coming down from it because the paperback just came out. So I re-engaged with a zillion Zooms and events. And then once the pandemic lifts more and there's more travel, I'll be doing some in-person speaking appearances about the book, probably in the fall. And because the book was so successful last year, and because Zoom became so logistically easy to do, I really was working. It really was like a full-time effort to support the book last year. So coming down has been slower than I imagined. I am working on a story for the Times Magazine that I'm happy about, and I am trying to do a little work on a possible miniseries for the book. So that keeps me plenty busy, but I don't have another big project right now. And I would like it to be about families again. I feel like I'm not done writing about families, that something about family dynamics and the estrangements and the reconciliations really interests me. And so I'd like to keep delving into that in some way. So I have that in mind as I look around.
I mean, since we've all been holed up because of COVID, I mean, we're doing this because of COVID, is there a takeaway that you would say from Hidden Valley Road that we can apply while we're, trying to come out on the other side? What would be your life lesson from this?
Well, but I'll start by saying that I think that one of the great things about larger narrative nonfiction books like Behind the Beautiful Forevers or Random Family or There Are No Children Here or Moneyball or any, pick your favorite, or The Blind Side, there's so many wonderful ones, is that they don't just transport you like a novel. They show you people going through some very real, extremely real, truthful challenges and suffering, and it helps you process whatever potential suffering you have. I mean, as a society, we don't talk explicitly about our problems. Someone asks how you're doing and you say, I'm fine, everything's great. But obviously it's not great. We all have issues that we're all going through. And so you read about the Galvins who are going through a lot, and you start to scan it for tips. You start to see like, well, what did they do? How did they make it through? And I think if there's a short answer that this book imparts, it's that the solution requires you not to turn inward, that you have to open up. You have to talk to other people. You have to work hard not to go through this alone, and to understand the value of the relationships you have with the others, even if trust has been broken, even if the worst things have happened to you because of some of the people in your family. You still need to find a way to build a family, because without it, you'll always be stuck in that moment of pain.
Well, I want to make sure that when you celebrate your anniversary and you're going to Provincetown, you make sure you stop in Falmouth too. We'll let music be played. It's okay. It's not a problem.
I mean, actually, seriously, I'll pop in because because of COVID, my wife can work remotely through the summer. So we're going to spend a lot of time probably in West Yarmouth. We're going to rent for a long time in the middle of the summer.
There you go.
So there'll be ample opportunity. So I'd love to swing by and see the library and the whole.
Love to meet you in person. This book is great, and I want to thank you for taking the time tonight. This has been really wonderful. I certainly have learned a lot about mental illness that I did not know, but just by reading this book, I have great admiration for you in putting this book together. I think the daughters must come close to walking on water, and so thank you very much for doing this. Continued success with the book. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and we'll hopefully see you later this summer.
Yes, I hope so too. Thank you, Mark, and thanks everyone for coming in tonight. And and I've been reading all the comments in the chat, so I want to thank everybody for your very kind notes and questions.
All right, thank you everybody. Good night everyone. Thank you.
Good night.